Our panelists are overseas and they're joining us with the technological facilities, and we will be directing our attention to the screens. Our three panelists are Professor Carrie Levitt, Dr. Terence Farrell, and Professor Robert Tignor. I will say a little about each of them now. And then they will follow each other without any interruption. And each panelist will be given 15 minutes. After the first panelist will be Professor Carrie Levitt. After she finishes, we're going to have a few minutes for questions to her because she has a parallel engagement at our sister campus on the matter of Lewis, and she's making a presentation there as well. So after Carrie, we'll have a few minutes for question and answer, and then we'll move directly to Dr. Farrell and Professor Tignor. At the end of their presentations, we will then have some more time for question and answers. So very briefly, we start with Professor Carrie Polanyi Levitt. She's very important in many, many ways, very celebrated scholar, all over the world, but for us what's important is that she's been seminal in the development of critical Caribbean thought, herself being one of the people who were involved in the New World movement that eventually spawned the Plantation Economy School. She's been appointed at St. Augustine and Mona campuses in the departments of economics over the years, and she's currently actually on a fellowship in the Department of Economics at St. Augustine. So in that sense, she's been one of us. But she's also, the Polanyi is that her father is Karl Polanyi, author of The Great Transformation and arguably the most important European intellectual in the 20th century. So she comes out of a very important European intellectual tradition of critical thought. And that, I think, has put her in a special position of pulling together the trends of critical thought coming out of the Caribbean and from Western Europe. The other thing that I think is important to tell you about Professor Levitt, a remarkable human being, but that she was tutored by W. Arthur Lewis. And therefore, she is in a position to speak about him, having known him throughout the course of their lives as an intellectual colleague. So that's Professor Carrie Polanyi Levitt. Then there is Dr. Terence Farrell, who once was deputy governor of the central bank in Trinidad and Tobago. He's currently a fellow in an institute for banking, I think, fellow of Institute of Banking and Finance of Trinidad and Tobago. But what is particularly important about him is that he wrote a very important article some years ago on Arthur Lewis and Caribbean industrialization. So he himself has spent a lot of time reviewing the work of Arthur Lewis. And then there's Professor Robert Tignor, who is Emeritus Professor of History at Princeton, and particularly the Rosengarten Professor of Modern and Contemporary History of Princeton. He specialized in the history of West Africa, and I think this is where he met Lewis in one of his disciplinary incarnations as economic historian of West Africa, but also in his capacity as theoretician. So a few years ago, about 10 years ago, he wrote a book called W. Arthur Lewis, A Life in Development Economics, a review of Lewis and the birth of development economics. So he too has engaged the work of Lewis as a scholar and colleague, himself being at Princeton. So I'm going to ask the three of them to make their presentations, 15-minute presentations. Again, Professor Levitt, at the end of her presentation, we'll spend a few minutes getting any questions we may want to pose to her so she can leave. And then we'll move straight into Dr. Farrell. He gets 15 minutes. And then Professor Bob Tignor, he gets another 15 minutes. Because they're not here, I'll put up their nameplate as they are speaking just in case you forget or you want to link the name to somebody. So without further ado, may I welcome our three panelists from wherever you are to Paradise, the center of the universe. And we await your contributions to help us to understand the relevance of Lewis today.
In preparation for this occasion, I went to look back and to read the fifth memorial lecture in memory of Sir Arthur Lewis, delivered in St. Lucia at the Central Bank of the OECS countries. And as I read this text, and I have I don't know if you can see this. Can you see that? Yeah, you can see it. But this is the lecture. And as I reread that, it simply caused me to admire Arthur Lewis even more than I had before. And I decided that what I would like to tell you in this forum, what I would like to suggest in this forum, is that the University of the West Indies is celebrating the life of Arthur Lewis, but I think we have not really appreciated his work or the methodology which lies behind his work and his life. And I think, particularly in the teaching of social sciences, economics in the first place, that you might like to consider the relevance of a course on the works of Arthur Lewis, because we have, I think, in the Caribbean, limited ourselves too much to the industrialization of the British West Indies, the Jamaica Development Plan, or even the first labor in the West Indies, without reading carefully or exposing students to his later work. And by the later work, I am thinking most particularly of the Schumpeter lectures called The Evolution of the International Economic Order, his Nobel lecture, which was called The Slowing Down of Economic Growth. Arthur Lewis was one of the first to note and to point to the fact that since the 1960s, there has been a consistent slowing down of the pace of economic growth in the major capitalist countries. That trend has continued to what today some people describe as an era of stagnation. One may think, and of course, the fact that he engaged in Princeton in a huge study on growth and fluctuations. I now would like to turn back to Arthur Lewis as a person. I have described him as conservative in demeanor, pragmatic in policy matters, but passionate as an anti-imperialist. I think he was a man of his generation is everything all right? In which the struggles for political independence of the colonial world of Africa and Asia, of course, was on the agenda. But he knew how to ask the right question. And the question he asked himself as he told us many times, was why did a person working, let us say, 8 hours or 10 hours in the Caribbean, cutting cane, earn so much less than a person working in a steel factory in North America or Britain? That, in technical terms, is a matter of the factorial terms of trade. Why, therefore, is so much cheap labor embodied in our exports compared with our imports from the metropole, speaking from the point of view of a peripheral location? And that together with the development problem, where I think he learned from studying Britain's development, where an agricultural revolution preceded an industrial revolution, the case he made for industrialization was so interesting because it was not made for arguments of comparative advantage. It was made as a result of an argument that began with the need to improve productivity in agriculture. Because as was said before in a panel, from 2 or 3 acres, a person cannot make a proper living in agriculture. So agriculture has to be land reform in order to reduce the number of farms to each a sensible, reasonable size, and that would further expel labor out of agriculture. And together with the fact that due to the history of slavery and the slave plantation, we have overpopulations, particularly in countries like Jamaica, it is most evident, there is need to find employment. So the reason for industry is to find employment for those people who will be expelled as redundant, as surplus from agriculture, because in order to have development, Lewis posited that the most important beginning was the improvement in agriculture in order that a country should be able to feed itself and produce a surplus for the urban population. And then we have his famous discovery as he walked on the streets of Bangkok. So he told us, and he saw that the solution to this problem was to remove the orthodoxy and to consider that labor is in surplus, and therefore wages do not move with productivity, but they stay very low so long as there is surplus in the labor market. And as he said, with one change of assumption, he came to the model, the famous 1954 economic development with surplus labor, which is the foundation model of Arthur Lewis, and actually I think the foundation of development economics. Because Arthur Lewis, together with, I would say, Raoul Prebisch and the tradition of Latin American structuralism, constitute the basis, I think, of development economics. But the fact that the problem he started with was which had to do with the low wages in the peripheral countries, and that low wage is an issue also of justice or injustice. And the fact that he managed intellectually to build a model that addressed two problems in a very innovative way, and that the case for industrialization was not because of comparative advantage, nor was it only in order to solve unemployment, but it was related to his belief, which he repeated many times, and more so in old age, that the most important thing about development is the capacity of a country to increase the food supply, to make a good living in agriculture, to be able to feed itself, and that although he did state, and very sensibly, that small countries would have to export manufacturers, it is a misreading of Lewis to consider that what he was pushing was the current and contemporary, what shall I say, predominant thought that outward-looking development is the way to go. He was not among those, in my opinion. Sorry, is that a sign? Oh, 5 minutes. So what I'm suggesting is, first, that we should have our students here read and become familiar with the works of Arthur Lewis. And secondly, that the reason why that is important is because he understood from the beginning that the conditions of the Caribbean or any other part of the developing world had to be understood in the context of the larger changes of the political economy of the entire world. And so I am suggesting that the theme of imperialism is not passé. I am suggesting that globalization as we presently know it is in many ways a non-territorial form of imperialism, that the structures of some thousands, 2,000 or 3,000 free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties have deprived countries of policy space, of the basically of an important degree of sovereignty, the inability to do, as Lewis says, to use their own resources in an innovative way for the benefit of their own populations. And finally, if I have only 1 more minute left, I would remind you of the many times when he stated that trade is important, but that is not the most important. Most important is to develop agriculture and food production, and those who depend on trade as the way forward are going to suffer disillusionment. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Polani. So, panelists and participants here, we're going to take a few minutes just to raise, for anybody who wants to raise any questions to Carrie Levitt, who is not going to be with us for the whole panel. So just a few questions, short questions, please. Let me recognize immediately Garnet Roper.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Levitt. I'm interested in your observation that globalization is imperialism without border or something like that. I liked it very much. Is there anything in Professor Lewis's methodology that could tell us how to respond to a new world in which issues of tourism and migrant labor are thought to be the ultimate expressions of development?
Sorry, I really have difficulty physically in hearing the question.
Let me try and repeat it. That you speak
Yeah,
you speak about globalization as a new form of imperialism.
Yeah.
And I'm asking whether in Professor Lewis's methodology there is anything that you could highlight to us to respond to the new reality And I've given an example of what I think marked the new reality in which tourism and the opportunity for migrant labor are the ultimate expressions of development.
You see, I'm not sure if I can answer the question directly because I'm not sure if I've understood it physically. But the reason why I am saying that what I said about globalization as a form of imperialism is because development has become, I would say, I have to use the word corrupted, to mean priority of the interests of foreign investors. The bilateral investment treaties, of whom there are now some 2,000, are treaties which bind the governments with regard to the treatment of foreign investors, who in effect, by these kind of protections, gain advantages of the absence of being forced into compliance with the regulations, mostly environmental or other kinds of regulations. And as the rules of the game, as we used to call them, increasingly favor international capital on the grounds that that is the source of development, societies become increasingly adopt the ways and the values of, if you wish, international capital, and the thinking of it in terms of gain and profit and trade and so forth. And I would maintain, and actually I have a passage in this lecture, which I just read, that if I had eyes that can read, because I can't know that, I would have read to you, which written in 2000, which is quite a long time ago, which talks about the fact that the resulting inequalities and the effects they have within society corrupt social cohesion, reduce social cohesion, increase criminality, increase corruption. This is a passage in this lecture, and I find that this has become such a reality and such a problem of daily conversation. What is happening in our societies, that they seem to be more lawless, that there seem to be higher levels of criminality. I speak from Trinidad, and that's where I'm talking from here. What is happening? And I believe it has to do with the fact that frontiers have become more porous. They have become, at the same time as we seem to embrace this globalization, I think we have to think in terms of a more conservative and more defensive attitude, and one which values traditions, values the way in which we used to be able to interact with each other in our Caribbean societies. That is not a way of looking backward, but I simply want finally to remind you there is one issue that has not been mentioned so far, very interestingly, and that is the entire matter of the degradation of natural environment and the movement to save it, and that is to save the planet from self-destruction, is in its nature a movement of conservation. It is a conservative movement. So we have to be careful. We are not permitting our societies to disintegrate. We have to think more defensively, and we have to remember it is not only the environment that must be conserved, but also culture and traditions. I will leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much, Carrie. Wonderful. So now we ask Dr. Terence Farrell to spend his 15 minutes telling us he thinks is the relevance of Lewis.
Mikey, thanks very much, and all of the attendees there. I think that perhaps the reason why I was invited here was probably because of Mark Figueroa, whose researches on Lewis might have unearthed my 1980 article, which was actually my first academic publication. I used to be an academic at one time. And it came about as a result of the work that I had done on my PhD dissertation on the manufacturing sector in Trinidad and Tobago. And having been schooled by Lloyd Best and grown up on Best and Beckford and Durban, what I found when I started to look at the facts in terms of the history of what happened in Trinidad and Tobago in respect of the policy of industrialization of the pioneer industries were a couple of things. One was that the policy that was followed by Trinidad and Tobago and other Caribbean governments was not the policy of Arthur Lewis. It was not. It was, in fact, a policy that was articulated by the local colonial administration that was taken up by these governments and implemented. It was very clear that Arthur Lewis advocated for export promotion from the very outset. There was no notion that I could see in Lewis about anything about import substitution. He advocated export promotion from the very outset, and he advocated the export of manufactured goods into the global marketplace. And I think that those are some very key markers. And he tried to solve the problem of how we could be successful, in fact, in doing that. And he identified a couple of things. One was that he identified the importance of keeping the wage rate low, hence the lowest model of surplus labor, keeping the wage rate low. And then he also emphasized the importance of capital, but not just capital in the sense of foreign direct investment, but also the fact that your foreign capitalists would be able to bring to bear the entree to those markets. They had the knowledge of those markets, how to move product into those markets, which was key. Now, when we take that aspect of Lewis, when we take those key points about Lewis, what we realize is that what Caribbean governments in fact did was not that. It was clearly not that. And it explains to a large degree the problems that we ran into when import substituting industrialization ran aground in the 1970s, 15, 20 years after we had exhausted the local market. So the point I want to make is that the Lewis model, of which there are really two models, one is you might call it a global model, and the other one is this Caribbean model, focused on a two-sector model. It focused on wage rates as being kept down in some form or fashion, probably by a natural market mechanism, but as I'll see in a little while, there are other ways of keeping the wage rate down, and also the generation of a capitalist surplus, which is reinvented through higher profit rates, reinvested in expanding the economy, and hence taking and lifting everybody eventually out of poverty, out of low incomes. Now, the issue for this panel is, before I get to the issue of this panel, let me just say that in the previous panel, I think it was Mark or somebody who referenced the fact that in East Asia, in Singapore, in China, that the lowest model was used. And I can say that that is absolutely true. That the lowest model, if you look at China, and there's a very interesting book by Arthur Praber called China's Economy, where he talks about the lowest model and how the Chinese authorities, in fact, implemented Lewis's model. But they did it in a way that perhaps only the Chinese could do it, and that is to say, keeping rural wages low and depressed by simply not allowing people to come or to migrate from the countryside into the urban centers. And they had a particular authoritarian mechanism for doing that, which of course would not necessarily fly in our democratic societies. So that Lewis, and there are articles written by Chinese economists such as Kai Fang. There's a whole issue of the China Economic Review in 2011, which talks about the Lewis model and whether or not China had reached what they call the Lewisian turning point. So I want to point out that in that, if you look at Singapore's strategy under Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore never tolerated this thing about import substitution. They embraced foreign direct investment very early on, and they embraced export promotion. They also understood the importance that Lewis emphasized of learning the tricks of the trade. Lewis's point was that you needed to develop a local capitalist class that understood the global marketplace and could navigate its way in the global marketplace. But to do that, they had to learn, and how would they learn? They would learn from the foreign capitalists. We rejected the foreign capital in the Caribbean. We thought that foreign capital was demonic. In fact, we ended up thinking that Lewis himself, right, we demonized him and we castigated his strategy as industrialization by invitation, when in fact, had we been patient enough in terms of the articulation of policy and done what Lewis had indicated that we ought to do, we would have been, without doubt in my mind, been a better place today. So if we look at the question of the continued relevance of Lewis's work to us today, the problem for the Caribbean remains the same. The problem is, how do you export and what do you export into global marketplaces? That remains. The problem remains of how do you increase your savings rate, and you can translate those savings rates into investment. Our savings rates are low. Our governments are profligate. They run deficits all the time. They run up huge amounts of debt, as we've seen throughout the region. And even within the private sector, saving is low. Household saving is low. And the third problem is the generation of the surplus. That is to say, generation of, we want to call it profits, generation of the surplus, and making effective use of that surplus by reinvesting that surplus and utilizing that surplus in the best possible way to generate continued growth. Those problems remain. Those are the problems that Lewis addressed in 1950. They are the same problems that we are addressing today in 2018. But it would be a mistake to think that we could take the Lewis model and the Lewis strategy of 1950, of 1955, and apply it to the world of 2018. We can't. It would be a mistake because certain things have changed. And if Lewis were around and if he were grappling with the situation today, he would not be coming up with necessarily the same sets of prescriptions that he did in 1950. And what is the difference? The difference is that today, in my view, we are not talking about exports of manufactured goods. We have to be talking mostly about exports of services. And by services, I mean all the things like tourism. I'm talking about energy services. I'm talking about those intangibles. Because it is going to be impossible, in my view, for us to compete except in very niche markets, except in the case of very unique products, to compete with the likes of China and other countries which can produce manufactured goods far, far cheaper than we could. But there is tremendous opportunity for us in the case of the sale and export of services, including tourism services, to the rest of the world. The second thing that has changed for us in today's world is that Lewis framed the problem in 1950, and here's where I disagree a little bit with Carrie Levitt in terms of what she just said, framed the problem in terms of comparative advantage. That is to say, looking at the factors and looking at factor prices and determining that we had a wage cost advantage here. And what he did in the 1950 article was that he tried to identify those particular products, those particular manufactured goods, where the labor cost ratio was such that we could potentially produce those products and export it into global markets. So that in that 1950 article, in the back of it, as I recall it, is that there's a whole list of products, a whole list of industries that Lewis sought to identify using his methodology that we could begin to export. Now, we can't do that today. That is not on. So comparative advantage which remains important. Price remains important. But what is also now important, and what is also now even perhaps more important, is the recognition, as I think somebody mentioned on the first panel, that it is actually firms that compete, and that in fact, yes, I understand. 5 minutes, I got it. And that in fact, because firms compete, you are talking about competitive advantage in addition to comparative advantage. So we have to talk in today's world about things like, for example, intellectual property. We have to talk about things like design. We have to talk about things like technical competence. We have to talk about quality. We have to talk about those things that enable our firms to differentiate the products and services that we produce for export from those of the rest of the world. So this notion of competitive advantage now has to be married with the idea of comparative advantage if we are in fact going to be successful. But there are certain things, having pointed out the things that are different, there are certain things that are the same. And if you look at Lewis very carefully, as Mark Figueroa and others have done, what you see is that he emphasizes certain critically important points. One is he emphasizes the importance of building consensus in society. When his writings on Africa and so on pointed out and emphasized the tribal nature of those societies and so on, and he pointed out that you are not going to get development, you are not going to get transformation unless these societies, Caribbean and African societies, found a way to build consensus, found a way to have social cohesion in those societies. And the second thing that is the same, and I think one of the earlier panelists pointed it out as well, is that Lewis understood capital not only to be physical capital, not only plant and equipment and machinery, but he also understood it to mean what we call now human capital, or what we now call knowledge and skills development. That is in Lewis in 1950, 1955, theory of economic growth, and that remains, in fact, perhaps is even more important to us today. So Lewis remains relevant to us today in those respects, but Lewis would have to modify his approach to the strategy in the context of, one, the need to export services and the need to develop and sustain competitive advantage of Caribbean firms. So with that, thank you very much. I think I have exhausted my 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Terence. Immediately we'll go to Professor Tignor, and then after that we'll have a discussion on some of the questions that you may have. Professor Tignor, welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being asked to participate in this wonderful occasion. I am a historian, not an economist, and so I thought I would emphasize Arthur Lewis's commitment to the West Indies, and particularly his contribution to the University of the West Indies. After all, you are celebrating the 70th anniversary of the founding of the University of the West Indies, and certainly Arthur Lewis was very important in establishing this university and getting it started in its early days. Let me just say a little something about the things that really motivated Arthur Lewis and what actually enabled him to be a distinguished public intellectual, scholar, political leader, university educator. And it seems to me that there were 4 things that motivated him and that he was deeply and profoundly interested in. The first was the issue of race. The second was economic development. The third was decolonization, anti-imperialism. The fourth was political independence, particularly the creation of democratic forms of government. But let me also emphasize that throughout it all, although he spent so many years outside of the West Indies, He would go back from time to time, and his remains are buried in St. Lucia, as I think maybe his wife's remains are. I'm not sure about that one, and I would appreciate anybody who knows the answer to that. She died several years ago. Both Arthur and Gladys were very, very good friends to me and to my family and to many of the people that I knew. So, but his commitment to the West Indies, in spite of the fact that the majority of his adult life was spent out of the West Indies, was deep and profound. And I want to emphasize that quite a little bit in the few minutes that I can speak to you. First, one of the things that made Lewis extremely successful was he was extraordinarily smart. Really, he's incredibly smart. I knew him as an individual, and he was one of the smartest persons that I have ever come into contact with. I'll give you an instance. A good friend of mine who was the director of the Committee on Regional Studies at Princeton University had to give a presentation to a select group of faculty and administrators. And the one person that he was most concerned about, I mean, even say terrified about, and as far as his presentation was concerned, was Arthur Lewis, because Arthur did not tolerate fools lightly. And Guy Black was not a fool, and he made a very fine presentation, and there were no problems, but he was concerned. He was worried about that fact. Now, let me quote you a few things. I happen to have read the Lewis papers, as I think Mark and several other people have, and they're very interesting, and they make it extremely clear that early on in his career at the London School of Economics, his faculty recognized his intellectual acuity. Here's something that Brian McGee, who was his first year advisor, wrote. He wrote this about him in 1933 or 1934. Lewis was McGee's, quote, best student, serious and hardworking, and remarkably intelligent. His essays show a maturity quite unusual in a first-year student. Remember, Arthur was only 16 or 17 years old, or maybe 18 years old, when he first enrolled at, I think he was 18, when he first enrolled at the London School of Economics. Arnold Plant, who became his primary advisor, also wrote of Lewis. I mean, it's really extraordinary. I wish I had certain things like this written about me. I don't think I ever have. May I say deliberately and with emphasis that Lewis is the most brilliant of all graduates whose work I have ever have seen since I returned to the school. He is already, he's under 20. He's already a mature, independent, and original thinker with a quite exceptional literary capacity. Lewis achieved first-class honors, graduated with a BA in Commerce from the London School of Economics, and as Mark Figueroa has pointed out, he sought some sort of employment right after he had graduated. He went to The Economist, he also went to the Colonial Office, and he was denied employment. But fortunately for him and for the economics profession, the London School of Economics said, well, Arthur, why don't you come back and study for a PhD? So, you know, even though he was confronted with racism, it somehow did not defeat him. And partly, I think that is because of his mother, Ida Barton Lewis, who instilled in all of the children of the family, 4 boys or 5 boys, I can't remember which it is, no girls, just boys, and she was a very, very dominant person in all of their lives. And she said to them, "We're as good as they." By that she meant we're as absolutely good as these white people who control our lives. Okay, so he goes to, he taught at LSE for a few years, and then he was given a position at the University of Manchester. And at that time, he was approached by the University of the West Indies, first in 1950, with an offer to become a professor of economics at the University College of the West Indies, and in 1951 to be the principal of the University College of the West Indies. And here I'm going to read his comments after having been offered the position as the principal, that is the head, what later on became the Vice Chancellor of the university. "My personal inclination is for working in the West Indies sunshine with and for my fellow West Indians." Apparently he thought highly of the sunshine capabilities of the West Indies. I'm looking out the window today, and actually it was overcast. We finally have some sunshine. "The point you make about the attractiveness of my present career as professor of political economy at the University of Manchester is not overwhelming. I became a teacher of economics rather by accident than from choice. I like the life very much, but I will leave it if I can be offered a job which is most useful, in which I feel I can do." Well, at that time, he did not think he was ready. But later on, he did become ready. Later on, he accepted a position. First, he accepted a position to become the head of the economics department at the University College of the West Indies. Right away, however, the principal stepped down, and so he moved straight away into that position. And he was very much committed to education, as we know, as a primary vehicle to economic prosperity and political independence. And even though he first agreed to become a professor of economics, he was delighted to serve as the principal, and ultimately became the first Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. He was thoroughly committed to the college, and through expanding, yes, I got you, to expanding the activities of the university throughout the many islands of the West Indies, and also persuading all of the islands of the West Indies to contribute financially and to send their best students to the university. I think that everyone would agree that Lewis was a good steward of the university while principal, and then the first Vice Chancellor, between 1959 and 1963. But the issue that Lewis dived into in 1961-62 was a matter that he felt passionately about all of his life: the federation of all of the islands of the British West Indies. He actually took a leave of absence from his position as the Vice Chancellor of the university in order to convince the major politicians, especially in Jamaica and Trinidad, with whom he had very, very close personal relations, especially with Eric Williams, that the best way forward for the British West Indies was confederation or federation. The British Colonial Office, which favored the federation, was not optimistic. They said that the only person who would maybe pull off what was considered to be an extremely difficult assignment would be Arthur Lewis. As we know, Lewis failed, but he failed valiantly. His effort totally exhausted him, left him with an ulcer, dizzy spells, and fainting episodes. He sought a physician's advice, And the physician told him that he must resign his position as Vice Chancellor. Otherwise, he would ruin his health. The university's Chancellor, Princess Alice, wrote to him that he had given his all and should certainly resign, which he did in August 1962 to take up an appointment as Professor of Economics at Princeton University. Nonetheless, by way of conclusion, it does seem to me that the University of the West Indies owes an enormous debt to Arthur Lewis for establishing that university in spite of the fact that the Federation of the West Indies did not materialize. It continues, and as you probably know, it has flourished for many, many years. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Prof. That really gives us a good background. A lot of people don't realize how important he was here at the University of the West Indies. Okay, now we open up for questions from the floor. Professor Bernal, would you go first? You can come here.
Just wanted to add a little history. If Sir Arthur Lewis had taken up the post of Professor of Economics here, he would have been in a very unwelcoming atmosphere. At the time, the department was entirely staffed by people from England. And at one point, and that person is in the room, the students protested at the lack of Caribbean material. Sir Alistair McIntyre was hired as the only Caribbean lecturer, and he waged a battle over 2 or 3 years to have a course on Caribbean economics. It was never fully accepted, and the compromise was to have a course called Caribbean Economic Problems. In other words, we had economic problems, but there was no such thing as Caribbean economics. And indeed, it was Lewis's intervention in support of McIntyre that allowed this course, the first and only one of its kind, Caribbean Economic Problems. So Lewis, I think, was fortunate to go into the Vice Chancellorship rather than into the Economics Department. Just as an aside, I took that course with Sir Alistair McIntyre, and later on had to teach it for many years. But he would not have been very comfortable in the Economics Department at that time.
Thank you very much. Maybe we should have a course on Caribbean economic solutions going forward. My question to Terence, if consensus and social cohesion was so central a strategy in Sir Arthur Lewis's model of development, given the degree of inequality that is present in the global economy and societies generally, today, what would be the strategy or the solution to getting societies to work together to realize the development model, given the technology, given the inequalities that we now face?
Terence, could you just hold, let's take a set of questions first, okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Elaine Campbell. I'm from the Faculty of Law, and I would like to address something that Professor Levitt said in terms of the network of foreign direct investment agreement, how they are actually forms of non-territorial forms of globalization, which controls trade and services. And now, in relation to what Dr. Farrell said, is there anything in the Lewisian model which would probably address a present problem of chain? For instance, we have global chains of production and standardization, which is now going on. I see these as also forms of non-territorial occupation, continuous occupation of the Caribbean.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your presentations for the panelists. It was very interesting and provocative. I wanted to ask Professor Farrell, to what extent does he believe that the Lewis model, as applied in the East Asian economies, contradicted the Lewis's approach? Insofar as Lewis's approach was more holistic and had an interrelationality between the social, the economic, and the political.
Okay, Professor OJ.
I am a historian by profession, at least they used to pay me for that title. And I want, without being a spoilsport, to say to what PVC Bernal said, Arthur Lewis had a very difficult time, not because he was Arthur Lewis, or perhaps because he was, but because the teaching of economics was not in the Faculty of Social Sciences because it hardly existed. Economics started being taught in the Faculty of Arts. The Faculty of Social Sciences was grafted on in Arthur Lewis's time when the Institute of Social and Economic Studies, which has adopted his name, was in itself in contention. So there's a certain simplicity in what Professor Bernal said, as well as what the Prime Minister Bruce said earlier on. And it is now too late. I should have stood up when Bruce made his point. The complexity of the West Indian staff, both in the Institute and among the economists, was not a simple one. Some people were to the very left. Most people were in a middle position. Carrie Levitt, in fact, and Lloyd were not breaking down Arthur Lewis. They were not attacking him. They were trying to see how he fitted, how the material he provided could be taken in and converted. In that time, the economists at UWI were really quite conversant with what the politics of Jamaica were. I remember being in a public discussion what to do with sugar. And I want to mention one name among the politicians, Lightbourne. Right? Lightbourne has a place that has been overlooked in what to do about manufacturing and export. And all of that needs to be taken into account. So I want to those of you who are left to say that if we look closely at the mental sets of the people we might broadly call social scientists, there were some who thought that the only way to break the colonial mind, as they imagined it, was violence. Right? And I can name one or two people in the Department of Economics and the Institute, and the articles are in the journal. This was not my fantasy. And there were others who were against. There were others who were socialists, reflected in PNP arguments. So we have some subtleties that are being missed. When Arthur Lewis decided, as one of his first policy decisions, that the report that established UCWI at 600 students was really impossible, right? And decided to expand the university. Expand the university? Dilute it? But that will be too long a conversation. But that was his first thing. His second one was promote West Indians. But when he started promoting West Indians, he said to them, listen, this is not a job created for you, you know. His line was, why don't you fellows ride bicycles instead of buying cars? But I'll tell you all the stories on another occasion.
Well, that's possible. Let me just say on the question of inequality, Lewis's model generates inequality. Lewis's model is predicated on inequality. But you see, the whole point of Lewis was that this was necessary for long-term development. That you had to have two things going on. One was that you had to have a high savings rate in the society, which of course meant sacrifice. People had to defer current consumption or immediate consumption so that you can have a higher rate of investment, a higher rate of growth. And the second thing that had to happen was that wages in a certain, and therefore incomes in a certain section of the society and economy had to remain low for a period of time. Now, the model does not address the social and political context.
Oh dear. Oh no.
In the model, sorry about that. The model worked in Asia and particularly in China because the Chinese have a system, I think it's called haiku, where if you are working living in rural China, you could not just come into the urban centers and look for a job. You had to be allowed to come to Shanghai or to Beijing. And in that way, they were able to suppress wages in the rural areas and have a staged process of bringing people into the higher income sector. Now, we couldn't do that in the context of the West Indies. And I think that Lois, both in the context of the Caribbean and Africa, grappled with this issue of how do you do that. And I think the point about social cohesion and the point about those kinds of what he called compromise, what he recognized was that this was required because the very process of development generated, at least for a period of time, income inequality and wealth inequality in the society. On the question of globalization, my own view, by the way, is that globalization has always been with us. The Caribbean has lived in a globalized world for the last 400 years. That's all we've known. And that is something which is to our advantage. I do not think that Lois, what Lois would have seen was that we had to engage a globalized world. That we were, as people keep saying, that what his mother told them, what his mother told him, that we are as good as they are. And that therefore it was not a case of saying, look, you are dealing with these terrible imperialists and multinational corporations, and therefore you should withdraw and you should, and so on. But you should engage them on their own terms and deal with them, negotiate with them in your best interest. And we have to have this self-confidence as a people, as a West Indian people, to be able to do that and to work things out in our best interest, engaging with globalization, not running away from it. And to the last point, as I said, I don't think that the political, social, cultural issues are at all contradicted in terms of Lewis's approach. The Lewis model indicated what we needed to do in terms of the economic variables, but in terms of the political and social variables, obviously Lewis as an economist was less explicit about that. I think some of it's right. I think particularly in Africa, give you some hints as to how he thought that the political process could be dealt with. For example, he talked about whether or not first past the post was an appropriate system to have in a situation where you have all of these tribes and so on, right, where it was probably not a good idea to have the Westminster type model in those kinds of environments. But those issues are issues that we've got to work out for ourselves. I told them, I don't think he ignored them. I think that they were important. I don't think that they contradicted his model.
Okay, let me thank our panelists and ask a final question of Professor Tignor. I dawned on me that as myself, a former student of Lewis's work, that I'm really not familiar with this last part here when he was at Princeton. And one of the things Carrie pointed out was the importance of his analysis of contemporary development of global capitalism. So I'm going to ask you to think about the ways in which the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Socioeconomic Studies can collaborate with Princeton in developing his work and, in fact, fructifying the research work that we do down here. I know I'm putting you on the spot now, but we would certainly benefit from your wisdom if you could, have some exchanges with our director in the future. So that's my request to you, sir. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
So let me thank all of you for participating, but then invite now Professor Henry Lee to close the proceedings.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am indeed very pleased that we had such a successful forum, and I'm told by a WhatsApp message that we actually have 4,000 persons viewing on Facebook, and we have many more online. So I want to thank them and acknowledge those who are online with us and watching via Facebook. You're not in the room. Maybe the next time we find a way to feed your questions so that we can get a more participatory approach to the forum. But there are many people to thank. I know it's a long day, but I want to start by thanking the Vice Chancellor, the PVC Bernal, Professor Cower, who stayed such a long time with us, the Sir Arthur Lewis family members who came. We had a former director, Professor Emeritus Neville Duncan, thank you, sir, and Professor Emeritus Elsie LaFranc was here with us. I want to say these names because for those who are listening online, SALISES has a very rich history. We were established in 1999, formed with a merger of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies and the Consortium Graduate School of Social Sciences. And so we are celebrating, the ISA part of us, 70 years with the university. And we have this celebration also taking place at Cave Hill campus, those of you in Barbados who are online and can attend. And we also have at St. Augustine, we should have a distinguished lecture at 7 p.m. Those of you in Trinidad, please attend. I want to thank all the presenters, the moderators, and all this couldn't have happened without a team that was tremendous. Dr. Dacia Leslie at the back, take a stand and let them know she worked very hard trying to get it all together. And all our staff members from SALISES, Richard, I see Richard, and also Sonia, but all the others for doing so well and keeping us on having such a successful forum. I also want to say that today is his birthday, and we continue the celebration of Sir Arthur Lewis on the lawns of SALISES Mona. We have the exhibitions of the work of ISA for the last 70 years. You will see some of the former directors, their research. We also have a little program for prospective students. For those listening online, and particularly, this is an ad, so please bear with me, those of you who are here with me at Mona. But we do have a master's in development studies, and we have MPhil, PhD program at SALISES. We have the public governance, we have social policy, and economic development in MPhil, PhD, and we are inviting you to come and join us. We have a rich history of research, and you can see from the passion in the room that Sir Arthur Lewis remains very relevant and very consistent in what we can do with his work to develop our Caribbean region. Two things that came from all what we have said, and maybe it's my bias towards Professor Mark Figueroa, but I do want to point out that two things that remain with me, having listened to all the presentations, is that we need consensus building and we need to make sacrifices if we are to attain sustainable development growth. So I thank you. I ask you to come and join us at the SALISES lawns and listen out for engagements and conversations emanating from SALISES. We have a conference, as Pat told you, on April 25th to 27th at Montego Bay. We are going to Montego Bay in the 70th anniversary of the university, because in 1947 there was an important conference. We discussed issues of integration of the region, and we thought it symbolic enough, taking the advice of the Vice Chancellor, to have the conference there. He will be giving the keynote speech, and so we look forward that you will join us again. We have an essay competition on Sir Arthur Lewis and the relevance of his work for students. So lots are happening. Listen to us. Come and engage with us this year as we continue to celebrate 70 years of service and leadership of the UWI. Thank you very much.